Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our talks with Walt, as we are calling now our movement and walking through the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. We are now starting from Paumanok section number 4 of the 19 sections of this somewhat long poem. Again, as we said, placed between the inscriptions, 24 texts and of course Song of Myself itself. Now our assumptions are that you have spent some time with us at learnstrong.net. Certainly we'd hope with the inscriptions 24 lectures already given, and then for sure the intro lecture and then the first 3-part sections lectures of starting from Paumanok. By the way, you can look in your descriptions information there and find the link for the actual intro lecture for starting from Paumanok. So much is said there that I'm not going to get into here, and we're going to jump now right into the discussion of the poem itself, beginning as we always do with first a reading of the poem. So I'll now here, let's go to work. Starting from Paumanok, I hope you have your own copy of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. Let's go to work. Passage 4. Take my leaves, America, take them south and take them north. Make welcome for them everywhere, for they are your own offspring. Surround them east and west, for they would surround you. And you, precedents, connect lovingly with them, for they connect lovingly with you. I conned old times. I sat studying at the feet of the great masters. Now, if eligible, oh, that the great masters might return and study me. In the name of these states, shall I scorn the antique? Why, these are the children of the antique, to justify it. Now, we said that our study of inscriptions was to get us ready for reading texts like starting from Paumanok. Go back, for example, to the text from inscriptions to a certain contradici, and see how this whole notion of take as an invitation is all there. Now, of course, this idea of leaves is, as we've said in earlier lectures, genius, because of course it can be the leaves of the paper, it can be the leaves that are representative of falling off a tree, it can be obviously those leaves at the conclusion of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. Here notice the invitation, take my leaves, and then the use of the word America. Now, as we pointed out in our lecture from the inscriptions, I hear America singing. Very rarely did Whitman actually use the term America. He reserved it for key moments in Leaves of Grass, and here it is. Take my leaves, south, take them, north. Now you've seen this directionality stuff already happening in this poem. That is to say, Whitman wants to be extremely inclusive. By the way, were you counting? Notice at 2b, there are 3 of these takes. Make welcome for them everywhere. Now again, this takes us back to Emily Dickinson's "This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me," her final line of that little ditty, "Judge tenderly of me." Here we're playing a similar kind of game. I would hope that there will be some welcoming. You'll remember the inscriptions, poems, that hope that maybe someday that those libraries would accept him here. He is speaking directly to America and saying, I hope that you will welcome my poems everywhere. That is to say, again, this inclusivity of Whitman's. For they are your own offspring. Now this is a fascinating word picture. Again, Whitman is father, Whitman producing children, or of course the states and the Americas producing its own children through Leaves of Grass. There's a certain kind of symbiosis that's in play here. Notice the use of the word offspring will later connect with the last line of the poem, children, and then to continue. Surround them. Now it's not south and north. And by the way, just little things that Whitman loves to do. Find out how often you say the 2 terms of south and north that way, as opposed to north-south, right? And of course, he'll play that same game of east-west is the way we normally say it, not west-east. But notice in that first line, it's south-north. Very interesting. What comes first, right? Notice he says, and you surround them from east and west, for they would surround you. In other words, encompass you in some way. And you, precedents, connect lovingly with them, for they connect lovingly with you. Now this idea of precedence is an important idea. In other words, he really believed, and we're going to see this so much in later poems of Leaves of Grass, Whitman genuinely believed that there was in fact this amazing thing that was about to happen in America, and in large measure because of his poems. He was going to be the bringer of a lot of that kind of thing. The children to be born would be born from his poem, Leaves of Grass. By the way, did you notice the use of the word, the two words, surround and connect? Okay, notice connect lovingly with you. This idea that what he is offering is a genuine article of love. And of course, we can't help but you hear the word connect and think of our own learning theory, that desire for us to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. A student once asked me, Mr. McGee, does a lot of your pedagogy in 303 derive from Leaves of Grass? And I have to be honest, here's a classic example of it. You can't help but read Leaves of Grass and have some sense of Whitman as pedagogue, Whitman as teacher, who is always talking about the connectivity that we have. Now he's going to pause for a moment, and sounding very much like one of the poems from Inscriptions beginning my studies, he will begin with this elated verb, I conned old times. Of course, that is to say, pursued, studied closely, old times. Later it will be antique, right at the very end of the poem. In other words, here we are. The new N-E-W is the new K-N-E-W. Whitman is a very progressive thinker, but he's not willing to completely, in his transcending and including, forget about the past, forget about the old. He says, I started there. I pursued my studies in the old times. I said studying, and then a very interesting word picture, at the feet of the great masters. Now, this idea of the word picture sitting at the feet, I mean, literally, this has to do with sitting on the floor during a time when the instructor would stand and then everyone would sit. Let's go ahead and point out, here we're obviously making some kind of a reference to Christ's Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew, the idea that Christ sat down and then everyone else is seated. This notion of sitting at the feet is also reverential. Put that in your notes. And Whitman is always wanting to show, I paid proper respect to those who came before. Obviously, he's talking here primarily Homer and Virgil, with some Dante and Milton and Shakespeare thrown in, no question. In other words, I paid my proper respects. I studied at the feet of the great masters. Now, and then the epistemological, as we call it, fallibilist position, that I think I'm right, but I could be wrong, that probability element. Now, if eligible, then the use of the word O, pay attention in Leaves of Grass every time this word gets used. Again, it's reverential and hopeful. Oh, that the great masters might return and study me. Now, we have to smile here because obviously Whitman gets his wish in our attempt to try to comment on every poem of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. If Whitman had known, and somehow he seemed to have known, but if he could have known certainly that we would be having these kind of conversations, I can't help but believe that he would have been somewhat pleased, although he would have said, you're only scratching really just the epidermis of what I was trying to say. But be that as it may, the masters of the ancient become now the new master in Whitman. And of course, let's say it out loud, as we've said in earlier lectures, Whitman is, of course, the great American voice. I agree here with Harold Bloom and other thinkers that there is no other poet that can anywhere come close to what Whitman does to define not just America, I believe, but the 20th century in general for the world. And of course, here we are in the 21st century, still, I hope, learning from some of our reading of these poems, right? And then the break, notice those three lines of the stanza unto themselves, and then the break, the last, if you will, couplet. In the name of these states, notice the work with these again, being very specific, shall I scorn the antique? Now this is a rhetorical question. Let's put it in our own words. What has he just asked? Because America is a new country, should I somehow scorn, that is to say, reject the antique, the old, that which came before? Go back to what we've said in our intro lecture. We are the stories that we tell and retell. We're also the stories we decide to accept. We're also the stories we decide to reject. Think about what it is that he's asking here. Should I reject the old stories? Should I have nothing more to say with reverence of the old stories? He says, why? And it's an interesting way. It's almost an Americanism here. Sometimes I'm asked, what does it mean to read American poetry? And you go to a set of lines like this where he asks kind of an interesting rhetorical question. By the way, this is not a question that would even get asked, should we scorn the antique? It's not a question that, for example, a Tennyson would ask as an English poet, right? But here, notice, this is a question Americans are going to ask, and his answer is an interesting one. Why? These, now the antecedent to the pronoun these is obviously this states, as in, or it could be obviously the poetry. It's, again, the symbiosis between the states of America and the leaves of grass that are in part of the leaves of grass we're studying here. Why? These are the children of the antique. To justify it, right? In other words, two things, right? He's asking, what is the value of the old masters? And he says, you, America. You're the product of all that which came before. Tennyson will say it in his classic Ulysses, I am a part of all that I have been. Yet all experiences in our through gleams that untraveled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. This idea that there's nothing insignificant. When we get to a child went forth, we'll play the same game again and we'll say it. Everything that you are is a construction of all of the events of your life and, of course, previous lives. Go back to our study of Plato's Republic and what Plato says about your education. Your education began long before two people hooked up and exchanged fluids to produce you, long before your education started. And of course, at the moment of conception, your education was ongoing as you were preparing for your exit into this world of darkness, from darkness to light, as Plato will play the game. We're going to play the same games with Whitman. These are the children of the antique to justify it. Now go back to our comments and inscription. Go back to what Lincoln says in the Gettysburg Address. America is a dynamic movement right now in Whitman's life. And yet, it's all about the test. It's all about justifying. It's all about making legitimate what it is that's happening. Now, was there a chip on the shoulder of the early founding thinkers from Ben Franklin and Jefferson on, certainly with Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman, that America would be taken seriously by the antique lands, those, that is to say, Europe itself. And you get some sense of this, right? In other words, Whitman is suggesting, hey, it's not that we don't appreciate what you guys across the Atlantic, across the pond have done and produced. We do appreciate all of that. However, what you have done provides us with the impetus to be able to do the things we will do. And in the process of doing it, we legitimate, we justify all of your hard work. Well, it is a fascinating little poem, and let's finish quickly at 2a. Obviously, we've said it, the new NEW is the new KNEW. All knowledge, all wisdom is in some ways cumulative. And this is why we have to be very, very careful in our discourse to not somehow just jettison, get rid of the antique simply because we have transcended and included it. And this is why we use the integralist language of Wilbur. The idea that we will transcend and we will include much of what came before, right? At 2b, notice, of course, the three takes at the beginning. The symbol of father and children, put that in your notes, we're going to come back to it, right? That is to say, the source of the new is the old, and we don't want to forget that. And of course, the use of a rhetorical question, we're going to see that a lot in this poem, in the collection of Leaves of Grass as well. At 3a, I've already mentioned some of those poems, just at least two of them, Contra Trece, as well as beginning my studies from inscriptions, although you can go back and find all kinds of references. I want to, though, just here point out one more time Milton's Paradise Lost, a text that obviously Whitman was very familiar with. He says it there in the opening lines, right? He's going to attempt, he's going to try to create something, things unattempted yet in prose and rhyme, to justify, notice the use of the language, to justify the ways of God to men. There is an argument, and I've made it already, of our big five. The fifth is, of course, theodicy. That what Whitman is really doing in Leaves of Grass is constructing the American theodicy, and as he does so, he constructs in some ways the American religion. We'll have much more to say about that one later in some of the other sections of Paumanok. Finally, at 3b, how about this one? And again, if you can own these kind of questions, then you can own this passage, and that's my hope for you. Is the antique, do you believe, necessary? Or can we finally get rid of it and live without it, transcend completely and just move beyond it? Is there any value in the old ways, the old thinking? Is there any value in it at all? I mean, obviously in AP, we spend a lot of time studying together the poets of the great lists of the dead white males, as they're sometimes referred to. Of course, our Homer, our Virgil, no question, our Dante and our Milton and our Shakespeare. Also, of course, yes, Emily Dickinson, as well as Tilly Olsen and Audre Lorde and the rest of Virginia Woolf. I mean, the whole list of them, they all came before. Is there any point in all of it? I think that when we look at a poet like Amanda Gorman, who is reminding us in the text, The Hill We Climb, that we've given comments on, you got to see the growth comes out of the ground, the roots go into the ground, and those roots are finding their way into those ancient stories, those stories that we accept or reject, those stories we tell and retell. What are your thoughts on it? And then finally, what do you consider to be the most important of all of the antique ideas? What Yeats will call in Sailing to Byzantium monuments of unaging intellect. I hope our study here of the sections of Paumanok will lead you to begin to have some reverence for those monuments of unaging intellect. Thank you.